perhaps a unique perspective on the idea of our lessons as they continue through conversions and looking at them. And today's conversion brings us to the center of the gospel of the gossip rings. Typically, when we look at our Bibles, we are told to stay away from busybodies and gossip and such of this nature. But in this particular case, we kind of run into an area of gossip in Acts chapter 17 that brings about some interesting results. When we stop and think about gossip itself, how fast and loud does it travel? It can get around the world before the person can wake up to tell the truth. And when the truth comes out, it's very muffled and hard to understand, or it doesn't make it as far as fast. You know, some gossip comes out, hey, let me tell you this juicy thing about so-and-so. I saw them do this. And without knowing the whole story or making something up, that news spreads far and wide. But when the truth comes out, it's hard to get the truth to travel the same ears, the same distance, and to clear up the former gossip. I guess that's why we're told to stay away from it as much as possible. But again, we get to this point here. Paul, during his journeys of preaching the gospel, is literally chased out of two different towns under threats by the Jewish brethren, some of the leaders there. I shouldn't say brethren, but some of the Jewish group. They refuse to hear the message of Christ in its fullness and obey it. So we are not talking about them being converted, unless you are converting them from their position of power to a position of power that is threatened, and they are taking it out on the ones bringing the truth. So they chase him and his companions out of Thessalonica under threat. Then they find themselves in Berea, and they are taking and able to preach there. They hear about it in a neighboring city, so they come to that city and chase him out of that one too. And the brethren help him out to get away from it. So when we get to this point, we see in the first 14 verses of how that occurs of Acts chapter 17. And now we are set here in verse 14. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. So apparently when Paul got to Athens, he looked at the city, and with one look, he looked at the brethren that brought him there and said, I'm going to need the other two to come and help me, because this is going to be a big job here. So when we arrive in Athens, he requests for them to come. It doesn't say it specifically, but I'm guessing that Athens at this time, we know Athens at this time, is very full of idolatry. It is very centered around that element. And Paul says, I'm going to need some help. But then he gets caught up, and we sometimes got to think, when we are having to give account for all that we have done, something that Jared brought out this morning in Bible study about the way people talk and all, is that sometimes when you have to explain yourself, you kind of go, well, you see, what done happened was, and here goes the story. When Paul is called in for account of going to Athens and being called into the center of gossip, you see, what happened was, how did he get there? Let's take a look. Being surrounded by all of this, he gives the command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed. And so we see in verse 16, now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. He couldn't just sit there any longer. He sat and looked around and saw that there was so much idol worship, so much stuff going on, that was completely against God. It just, have you ever sat someplace and just got irritated by the things going on around? The amount of chaos and everything around you. Paul was looking around and was like, I can't take it any longer. I have to do something about this. I have the word of truth. They don't. They have rejected it. They haven't listened to it. They have gone to anything but. It's time to bring it here. So in verse 17, as it was custom for them to do, therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. So he went about doing what he always did wherever he went. He went to the synagogues first because that would be your prime spot to talk to people about the God of creation, of the Bible. He also talked with anyone that would listen. Now, before we get too much further here, we see in this next verse, then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, what does this babbler want to say? Pausing right there to look at what all is in this verse, we see that this is where the gossip center takes hold of Paul. These two men, an Epicurean and a Stoic, not getting too deep into the weeds on them, but they're both of different backgrounds of philosophy and ideas. And I've got a very brief statement about each in the outline here, where the Epicurean philosophy was a system of atheism. It doesn't ignore that there are gods, but they don't believe in the gods. It taught men to seek as their highest aim a pleasant and smooth life. If it makes you happy, if it makes you pleased, if it makes your life easy, that is our aim. It does not allow for the interactions of a God in your life. So there are there might be gods out there, but they don't interact with humans at all. They're just there. Some people look at God today as an old man in a rocking chair waiting to stomp on somebody or to get you in trouble. He set the thing in motion and he's just off someplace. He's not paying any attention to us. The idea of something like that. If you want to believe in a God at all. But they don't care about them because they don't affect their lives. The Stoic, a man's happiness is consisted in bringing himself to harmony with the course of the universe. They were trained to bear evils with indifference and so to be independent of any external sources. So do what you want to do as long as you're okay with it and it doesn't really matter. So we have two very worldly ideas and mindsets, and amongst a city filled with idols and all these different teachings, they were curious as to what he had to say because, we like to hear new things. We want to hear what else is here. And so in verse 19, we see that he says, what does this babbler want to say? Finishing verse 18. Others said he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. Something the Epicurean would have a great issue with because God doesn't involve himself, any of the gods, lowercase g, don't involve themselves in human affairs, and yet you're saying God became a human, interacted with us, and died for us, and now he is resurrected and waiting for us. Nah. But you do sound interesting what you got to say. And so their interest was piqued. Verse 19, they took him and brought him to Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak. Tell us. They took him to Mars Hill. Depending on which translation, whether you're coming from the Greek or the Hebrew, they both are coming out. Areopagus or Mars Hill. He brought him there. What doctrine do you speak of? What are you talking about? I haven't heard this before. My ears are itching to hear a little more. We want to know this. So they bring him up to the gossip center. They bring him to this great place on top of one of their mountains, this great little theater place to be able to listen, where everyone is coming and either talking about something new or listening to all of the news so that we can get in on the good stuff. Right over their shoulder is another mountain that shows off the great might of their idolatry worship and of everything that they have, into the point that the hill behind, you had the Parthenon and other grand buildings and sculptures of their many gods. I forget how many. I was reading through, getting ready for this lesson, and I saw somewhere in the thousands were quite possible of how many gods they had, or because they didn't want to offend anyone. They didn't want to offend anything, and so there was a God for everything, for every mood, for every emotion, for every opportunity that you wanted to take to make up something else. So they are here. And we see this place as being a place of great talk in verses 20 and 21. For you are bringing some strange thing to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean. For all the Athenians and foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or hear something new. They lived for the gossip. They lived for tales of something else. And so, no wonder that even though the Epicurean and the Stoic may not fully believe in what Paul is saying, this is new. And I'm going to bring them new information. Come with us. And brought him there. And notice, Paul went. We're to stay away from gossip. But Paul's not gossiping. He's been given an invitation that very few can receive, perhaps. How many chances do you get to go into an idolatrous area who doesn't know or follow God and be asked to speak? He has been brought into the center of gossip to spread the truth. Paul took the opportunity, we see in verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. Some translations say very superstitious. He stood up on the invitation to give the truth where it may not have been able to be given. We see in the next verses, summarizing this out for time's sake, but please go back and refresh our memories on this. We see how much was given. Christ was preached to them. He starts off with an introduction that catches their attention. Remember, this is a group in this area. They don't want to offend anyone. They don't want to miss anything. So they even built an altar to the unknown God. To him, I'm going to speak to you today. He used their own superstitions to open the door. He acknowledged what all was going on there. So he taught Christ, emphasizing that he created the world. He came to earth as a human. He died. He rose from the grave. All items were against the main belief of at least the Epicureans that God involves himself in human affairs. On several others, it's like, there's only one God? What about all these others? What about all the statues you came by? What about this idol that I'm whittling out while I'm listening to you? There's one God, and he has done all of this, and he is still active today. When we look at all of this, Paul was able to stand in the midst of a group of gossipers and proclaim the truth. Now, when that happens, we have, like anything else, two different results. Paul did when he is asked, so what had happened was, I was preaching your word, and I got invited to speak where no one else could get to. And I spoke the truth. There were some who laughed and mocked at me for what I had to say, because we see in verse 32, when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. I guess that is kind of an interesting thought to think about. You know, even today it might be hard to wrap our mind around it, because we know that when that casket closes, it is closed and they're not coming back. But to think and see the evidences that we have about it, we can still reason today that it is possible through the power of God. After all, He created all things in the first place. We also see where others said, we will hear you again on this matter. And all these philosophers, not all of them were gossipers, some of them were philosophers, and they would listen. They were either talking or listening. They would listen and reason about what they're hearing and decide what was worth listening to again. And apparently there were several that decided what he had to say was worth listening to again. So Paul departed from among them. He spoke his peace. He heard some laughing. He heard some say, we'll hear you again. He departed off the stage. He didn't stay to participate in the rest of the gossip session of all the babblers, of all the philosophers, of everything else. He had a job to do, and that was spread God's word. He wasn't there to gossip. He wasn't there to take in the tea, as they call it today, sitting around the water fountain, whatever vernacular we're used to. He wasn't interested in staying there for the rest of it. He was the guest speaker, and when his time was up, he departed to go on about his business. But he also see in 33 that he departed from them. In 34, however, some men joined him and believed. Among them were Diogenes, Areopagite, a woman named Demarius, and others. We see that Paul was given a great opportunity. He was able to talk to a group that didn't believe or didn't even know. They believed it too much. They gossiped about too much. And he made it very simple. There is one God. To him, let me reveal to you now. We see the interactions of him in our lives. We see that he taught the death, burial, resurrection of Christ. We see that he taught what it meant to live the life serving one God, the true God. And like anyone else in the history of the world, all the way through back to Abraham and possibly even before, when you talk about the one true God, you have two options. Follow him or not. We see that several did not, but we also see that some were still piqued in their interest, and we see others started to follow him and believed. If all Paul did was go and sit there and wait for Silas and Timothy to show up, what would have happened? Would he have gotten this invitation? He went to the synagogue and taught there like he usually did. He talked out in the streets with people that would listen. Because he did that, he was overheard by someone who could bring him in the door to a massive audience of people eager to listen to new things. Sometimes we don't know where our teaching will lead us. We don't know where, a conversation will go. This time it went all the way to the ears of a whole lot of people. And some believed. God rejoices over every single soul that comes to him. Was it worth it? Paul would say yes. God would say yes. Because we know that his nature and all of that is there. Those people that just came out of that gossip center following Paul are no longer in that sin. They're no longer in that environment, and they're now living for good, for Christ. What did they go on to do? They still have influence with people around them. They still have connections that they can go back to and have those further conversations with. What good happens after this day we don't have the records of? What good happens from our actions each and every day? What does our influence look like when we take the opportunities that are before us? Do we end up like Paul? Someplace we never thought we would be. I was asked one time, right after I became a Christian, have you ever thought about preaching? I said, nope. And the honest truth is, no, I hadn't. I just became a Christian. Apparently that was this lady's question to every male who believed. You ever thought about being a preacher? Nope. Who would have known that teaching one Bible study at the Student Center, however many years ago that was now, was a stepping stone to start working me to be here. Just going in one day and having a talk about food ended up to me being here. How many of those instances do we not even realize because someone took an opportunity? Paul took an opportunity to go into the gossip center and to be able to explain. See, what happened was, I got an invitation to tell the truth. I told the truth, and there were those who believed. Everyone that was there got to hear what the truth was. Mm-hmm. Whether they believed or not, I did my job by sowing the seed. We can go back and look at the seed sown parable of 4 different soils. For those who believed, I gave the extra attention to. For those who didn't, they heard it. They're now responsible. What do we do when confronted with these opportunities and these different options? When we run into someone who just likes to gossip and talk, do we engage in the gossip or do we engage in the truth? Takes a little rethink of how we say things or what we say. What's our response going to be if we end up in the gossip center? How are we going to answer? See, what happened was, will we be able to finish the story like Paul did? I spoke the truth. If anyone has need of the invitation, the invitation was given there at Mars Hill. Paul gave them the truth, which includes the ability to obey, to stay faithful to the one true God. If we have need of that or of any aspect of it, let the needs be known so we can support and help one another. All together we stand.